We are so excited to have with us this afternoon researcher and barrister Warren Forster. Warren, thank you so much for joining us here this afternoon.
Kia ora ihoa, thank you for having me.
Warren, off the back of last Friday's announcement, you must be absolutely ecstatic. Tell us how you're feeling about the announcements on Friday.
Well, thanks, Jade. If you imagine there's a vision for the future, which is that we can remove disabling experiences, those negative experiences our people have every day across the motu, the people who face barriers, they can't get the support they need. It's great that the government has recognised that and said, here's the direction of travel. We're going to do something about it. So that part of it is fantastic. But like everything, if you spend your life experiencing something or your life researching something and how to actually remove these disabling experiences, these negative things that people face, this is what you want. You want something that's the best in the world, that's going to work for now and for generations. And we don't have that yet. We got something down here, but it's better than where we are now. But we want to raise that to here and we want to keep it going up. And that's really the challenge now for disabled people, for researchers, for our leaders to think, is this enough? Is this actually going to work to change the people's experiences? And if it's not, then we need to keep pushing. And that's really, that's how I feel. So I've worked on something for a long time. It's come to fruition. It's great to launch a research report and then a month later have the government say, hey team, we're going to turn this into legislation. That's pretty much unheard of in our space. And the reason that that's worked so well is because we've had the disabled community, we've had government, we've had policymakers, we've had everyone talking for 3 or 4 years about what it is we're trying to do. And it's great that we can do that, but we're not there yet. And with the legislation that they're proposing, I don't think we're going to get there quickly.
So quite separately from this legislation announcement was your report. And in your report, you had, and this wasn't just your report, I want to be very clear, you worked as part of a team on this. Tell us a bit about what recommendations you made independently of this legislation.
Look, thanks, Jade. And just to acknowledge Tom and Curtis, who spent so long working on this. This work was done with the support of the Law Foundation, otherwise it wouldn't be a thing. And what we did in the report is we set out a whole lot of ideas that we think are the sort of the central ideas. And when you come time to draft legislation, they're the key things you need to define. So we have a chapter that does that. Then we talk about what we really need, which is a regulator. And the regulator's job, like if you imagine we've got walls already of buildings, we've got different standards that talk about this, different standards that talk about that, but those walls have no foundation, they've got no roof. There's no coordination that brings that building together and makes it work. And we say we need a regulator that sits across everything, and that's their job. So that's the first thing is that regulator. Now the government hasn't announced a regulator. They haven't announced that coordinating body. They say some chief executive of a government department should do that. And my response is, well, we've had chief executives of government departments for a long time. We don't need a new law and a chief executive to make this a thing. So that's the first critical point that we said that they haven't come on board with yet. The second thing is standards, and they have come on board with standards. And we say that we can have non-enforceable standards, which is everything we start working on collaboratively now, and we start figuring out what works, we start innovating, we set the direction, and as we need to, they become enforceable. So they then become someone's job to make them a thing. So we got a regulator, we got standards, and then we have what we're calling a notifications process. And that is how everyone with that lived experience says, here's this disabling experience I have. It's not, no one can argue with me about my experience. It's true, this is my thing. And then it's the regulator's job to say, how is this experience created by barriers? And how can we remove it by removing those barriers? So that notifications process, we have all of us who experience these disabling experiences across New Zealand can come together and actually work collaboratively to remove these That's that system of notification and identification of barriers. Then we have this feeds back into the standards development process. And the final bit, which we don't think we're going to have to use very much, is enforcement. And that is when someone actually says, hey, here's this barrier that exists. Here's an enforceable standard that is meant to remove this barrier, and you're not doing it. You aren't actually removing the barrier. Please do that. And like you can imagine, that might sound like a big scary thing with someone coming along with a stick and saying, like, we're going to whack you until you take that barrier away. But that's not really the reality. As we learn about what we can do together to remove barriers, I think we're going to see most people doing it. But what they need is a bit of law that says, hey team, here's what we need to do. And that's why we need an enforceable standard as an end state of this process. And we think that by telling everyone, look, eventually you're going to have to do this, so let's get started now, sends a really strong signal to people to collaborate and actually work together to remove those barriers. So, and then you've got to process how you sort out disputes. If someone says there's a barrier here and you need to remove it, someone else says no, there's not, or I don't need to remove it, we need a way to sort that out. So we talk about that as well. But they're the key bits of making the legislative model work.
So are you telling me the accessibility governance structure that was announced on Friday, that's not actually part of this then? It's something different?
Well, what they're saying is that we can do all these things that the research project concluded we needed to do with an accessibility governance board. And I just don't think that's going to work. If you put the onus on a group of people to do all this, to do all the research, to get all the data together, like we're just going to have people on a board that are nominated by a minister, and we're not going to have the infrastructure we need to design a system and make that system work. So I don't think that a governance board is actually going to cut the mustard. It's one way. This is what they have in Canada and the provincial system, but there's no way for people to actually connect.
Yep.
And I don't think it's the right thing to create a burden on 10 disabled people on a governance board to say, hey guys, it's your job to go and connect to everyone to tell us what we need to do. It's just, I don't think that's a thing. I have no problem with a governance board, and I have no problem with the innovative co-governance model that we're working to develop. Great ideas. But unless you've got the health and safety system has WorkSafe. They got hundreds of employees. Mm-hmm. Their job is to do this. Mm-hmm. If you just had a governance board for WorkSafe or health and safety, that's kind of what you had for ages, and it didn't work. So you've got to have an infrastructure. It has to be a whole lot of people's jobs, hopefully disabled people, to actually do the mahi and then tell what the governance board or the minister or whatever it is, what needs to happen. And there's, in my view, anything short of that is less likely to work. And that's what we keep coming back to is, how do we design a system that actually is going to work and is actually going to remove these barriers? That's the core thinking behind what we do. And then how can we structure this so that it centers disabled people and their lived experience in this whole process? So if you had to say to the disabled people, you identify the barriers, you go to the governance board, you convince the governance board to deal with your barriers, and then what happens then? The governance board goes to a ministry chief executive and says, hey, chief executive of MSD, can you ask nicely for these barriers to be removed? We can do all of that now, and it won't work. It hasn't worked.
I see what you're saying, Warren. I've never had it laid out this way for me before, so thank you for framing it up that way, particularly for our viewers who may not be so connected to the disability sector or policy in general. Lots of people that watch us wouldn't be near that stuff. One question I want to put to you as a disabled person is, why are we comfortable with non-enforceable standards at first? Isn't it really time to kick the can down the road, so to speak, and get things going?
So, undoubtedly, yes. But what we see internationally, and I'm going to take Canada as an example, they have accessibility systems in each province. They spend 2 years making each standard. So over 10 or 15 years, they got 5 standards. Tick, got those standards in place. I just don't think that's a thing. Now, what I want to do is I want to say, hey team, let's all collaborate and say, here's like 40 different areas that we want to do a non-enforceable standard in. Let's get cracking on 40 different things. As we identify these barriers, let's start work. Let's say, here's the way we're going. And what's going to happen is we're not going to spend 10 years fighting about what technical words go into something and guessing what actually is going to be the case. What I'm saying is, let's get everyone together, identify these barriers, and let's start innovating about what works. And as we find out what works, we can then turn that into an enforceable standard. And so the best example is the web stuff, web standards. There's a new web standard.
Yep.
There's been a whole lot of them developed. If you take a web standard and you develop it into a enforceable standard, by the time you make it an enforceable standard, it's already outdated. And this we see happening over and over again. And we don't get any standards until everyone agrees on what they should be, and everyone says, I don't know if that should be a thing. Instead, what we're saying is, let's get everyone focused in the right direction. Let's start with a whole lot of non-enforceable standards. Some we can make enforceable tomorrow. We can really easily say 70% of new builds need to be accessible houses. We can make that a law, away we go. We don't need anything to tell us what that is, except this has to be a thing. But having an accessible house or stock of accessible houses doesn't actually mean people get into and can live in these houses, because there's other barriers, transportation barriers, work barriers. Like, can I afford actually to buy a house or to rent a house? So we've got to think outside the box. And what we see, if we come back to these removing disabling experiences idea, what we see internationally is a small set of enforceable standards over a 10 or 15 year period doesn't actually cut the mustard. And that's why I'm saying we need a data system to tell us what's working. We need to be able to innovate. And as we innovate and can show, we can work with businesses that want to be proactive and actually start designing, delivering accessible systems. As we move along this journey, we're going to learn. People are going to be confident, yeah, it can be done. And that's going to, in my view, allow for more change more quickly, and us to figure out what does work and doesn't work and turn these into enforceable standards at the time that we either need them to, or they're mature enough that they then become enforceable. So that's how we looked at this as researchers, and it sort of came back to this question of what's more likely to be effective. How do we center disabled people in their experience? How do we learn from this and actually then deliver change?
Amazing. Thank you, Warren. So I'm really keen to ask you, how does New Zealand compare currently with somewhere like the United States that has the Americans with Disabilities Act?
Okay. I'm not an expert on the American with Disabilities Act.
Oh, was that not part of your... I don't want to take you to a place where you haven't been, Warren.
No. But what I'd say is some things work really well in America for disabled people and some things don't. And certainly what there isn't is there's not a system for providing social support. There's not a system for providing income support. There's not a... their systems don't exist the way that we can create them here. But some things, there can be accessible ATMs. Fantastic, that works. There's a whole lot of other things that on an individual basis work, but there's no point having an ATM if you have no income and you can't do something about it. There's no point having an ATM if you can't get to the place to use your ATM. There's no point having an ATM if you can't work and so on. And to be honest, I don't know when the last time you used an ATM was, but I don't use ATMs very often. I do it all online. And again, not trying to sort of, be too controversial here. Great idea, had an important place in the world, started some important work, but I don't think it's a thing that's actually going to work here in Aotearoa. And from that perspective, I don't think we need an American with Disabilities Act. I don't think we need a Canadian federal legislation model. I don't think we need a model based on any of the provincial systems, because they don't centre that lived experience. Like you've got a governance board, you've got a group of people, they tell the minister, hey, here's the things that we think you need to do something about. You do your 5 standards, tick. No one then comes back and says, does this actually reduce all these negative disabling experiences? Do we have an accessible society as a result of them? That's just stuff that like, yep, tick, done the law, great. Now what? And that's the stuff which I think we need to really avoid replicating here in Aotearoa. And as we create these new systems, new barriers will emerge. And along that line, we have to have a way to say, hey, look, here's this barrier that's coming through. People are telling us that this is creating a negative experience for them. Here's what we can do about it. And the interface between the accessibility and the disability support system needs to be really carefully thought about. If we're not going to provide income support or retraining and help people get into jobs, how do we actually address this stuff? There's something like 150,000 disabled people here in Aotearoa who want to work. But that's a massive policy failure that we don't do anything about that. Like we've got a skills shortage. We've got a shortage of people to actually do work here. Imagine the impact on the economy, on people's experiences, if our system was designed to actually help people get into jobs that are meaningful, that they want to do. Like, and I tell you what, if you socialize that cost, if you say we're all going to provide income support for these people the same way we do with the ACC system, everyone will really quickly work out how to help people get into jobs because it will save money. But again, you go back to this housing system. Having an accessible house doesn't mean people can live in it. And until you start integrating and joining these dots up, how is it we're actually going to create substantive change? And that's really the question that drives me. And that's what we've got to look at as a society. What are we going to do? Is this going to work for our people, or is this going to work easily within a government structure? Now, the government's really good at making things that work within a government structure. They do that all day. It works well for them. But what we've got to come back to is this actually going to create the change that people need to start removing these negative disabling experiences? And if the answer is yes, great. But what we want to see is we want to see people think about what the government is saying. We'd like them to compare it with the work that we've done and make up their own minds about what they think is going to work for them. Because ultimately, disabled people need to make these decisions about what they want and communicate that to decision makers in government. And that really is what we're trying to do, is to say, hey, look, here's a way that we think is going to work. Tell us if you want this. And ultimately, that's a decision not for me, but for everyone out there with that lived experience to decide what's going to work for them.
So for people at home that are still getting to grips with what's been announced, Warren, and if I'm honest, it sounded like you were a little bit disappointed about the announcements at the front of the interview this afternoon. What would your message be to disabled people out there about what the next steps for them should be? How should they get involved?
So, everyone out there who's listening, who's interested in this is the once in a generation opportunity to design a system that we can then use for the next 20 or 30 years to bring about change. I challenge you to engage with the government's ideas, to engage with other ideas, and think about what's going to work best for you. What are you most confident will bring about change for you now and for your children and your children's children, for your friends, for society? We're all connected here in Aotearoa, and we get to decide what laws we want. And we're at the point now where we can say to our government and to our MPs, yeah, that's a good law, much better than where we were, but here's where we want to be. And if that's how you feel, you need to articulate that and share that thoughts with the decision makers. Because otherwise what's going to happen is over the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to see governments making decisions that work for governments, not work for people. And that's not, in my view, the best way forward. So think about not just what's going to happen now, but in the future. How do you want to engage with the system? Do you want a group of people that the government appoints on the governance board to figure out everything for you and tell you how to fix it? Or do you want a process that centralizes you and your experience and aggregates this up and actually generates data about what these experiences are so that someone can then design them away? Do you want the chief executive of a ministry of social development or somewhere, or do you want to work safe? Do you want a group of people whose job it actually is to do it? And these are the questions that you need to decide. And once you've made those decisions, you need to communicate them. And I'd encourage you to talk to anyone else who's interested in this space, share your ideas, and let's work together to make the best possible law that we can that gives us confidence that this is going to work for us in the future to actually remove these barriers.
I did have one more question on this, and then I'd like to take a few more minutes of your time to just comment on the Ministry for Disabled People. Coming to the component of your recommendations around reporting, and I've spoken to you about this offline in the past, Warren. Tell us what your framework provides in the way of preventing Karen reports. We're really free with our language on this podcast, so we can actually refer to it as that. But I'm always worried about the Karen test. So how will your reporting structure avoid some of that?
Well, I have a few friends called Karen. Some of them might actually watch this, so just need to be a bit careful.
Shout out to all Karens out there, by the way.
Shout out to the Karens. Love your work. Look, at the end of the day, what we see internationally is every 3 years there's a review done. They do it everywhere that there's a system in place. And the reviews generally come back and say, hey, you don't centralize the lived experience of people. Hey, how can you get all disabled people more involved in this stuff? Hey, how can you collect data and gather data on things? So the best example is that in Canada, when they started the system, they made everyone with more than, I think, 20 employees or 20 people involved do a self-report every year about how well they're doing in meeting these new accessibility standards, which is great. Like somewhere in some archive in Canada, there must be like millions of reports generated by people about how great they're doing. And that's pretty much what the focus of the resource was. Now that doesn't work. No one's actually got these dumb PDF documents and scanned them and analyzed them and seen what's happening over and over across the board. A whole lot of consultants have made a lot of money making good spin out of this, I'm sure. But ultimately, that's not what it's about. So what I want to try and do with this is centralize that lived experience, which is why the data system that sits behind the notifications process is critical. If millions of notifications are coming in each year saying, hey, this is like a terrible thing and I'm having these terrible experiences, and we're putting these standards in place and nothing's happening, we're failing. We're absolutely failing. But if we're saying, hey, there's these millions of disabling experiences that come in the first 2 years about transportation or work or whatever that thing might be, and we can learn from them, and we can develop standards innovatively and quickly and say, hey, is this working? Yes, the data's telling us it's working. We're getting all these notifications telling us how awesome it is. Great. Let's learn from that. And let's then work in a new area. So having a data-driven system and a reporting system that's inbuilt will actually allow us to front-end that experience of people and back-end that experience of people, which will tell us if it's working. And this is why I think it needs to be outside of government, because like we've all seen the list of issues that goes off to the UN. It's where the UN asks some questions of the government and says, hey, tell us what you're doing with all these things. The government's response is, yeah, we're doing great. But actually, if you scratch below the surface, we're not. And we have this repeated time and time again. And having these kind of bright, shiny reports with glossy pictures on the cover of smiling disabled people is really good for the models that actually get to do that. But for everyone else, it sort of gives this veneer of legitimacy to a broken system. And that's what we see time and time again. And the only way to overcome that, in my view, is with evidence. So if you have a data system...
Yeah, just to challenge you on that, I'm mindful of the shadow reporting process. So does the shadow reporting process help to sort of keep things on a truthful level, shall we say?
It does. That's the whole point, is that the question is, how are we doing? The government says, oh, we're doing great. And then you've got to do all this work on shadow reporting to come up and hopefully bubble above the surface to show everyone it's not working. But in these kind of reporting processes and the reviewing processes that happen, often the government, if it's controlled by a government agency, often the noises that are coming out is it's great. And that's why I'm saying that evidence, data, people's lived experience feeding into this can tell us if it's working or if it's not. And this is kind of the critical thing, is that, you know, should a group of people have to go and do all this work on shadow reporting to the UN every 4 years to bring about change in an accessibility system? Or should we design a system that does that every day, every month, every year?
Thank you.
And actually sort of measures in real time what's happening. And we can design that system now.
Yep. Awesome, Warren. I'm mindful of time. We're actually a little bit over time, but I've only just learned that some of the research you have done may have informed the Ministry for Disabled People. So just wondering if you can speak to us about work you've done in that area.
Look, thanks, Jade. And I've got a report that's going to be coming out sometime soon, based on some research I did, that talks about how do you design a universal, integrated, person-directed system to provide income support, social support, financial support, rehabilitation, healthcare in a single model. Because that's the ACC idea. Mm-hmm. Now, what we've done with the Ministry of Disabled People is we've taken support services, you know, funding for support out of health, and we put it there. And that's great start, fantastic work. We now have an infrastructure, we've got a ministry that we can start adding all this other stuff into. But if we just leave it as providing social support model through, you know, enabling good lives, which is great, we do that nationwide, which is great. But until we integrate that with income support so that people can actually afford to live the best life that they can, until we integrate it with healthcare so that people can actually get the services and treatment they need, until we integrate it with training and actually pathways into work, you know, we can't have a ministry for disabled people that only does part of it. It won't work in the long run. It's not going to include mental health, doesn't include accident. All the discriminatory effects of the existing system cannot be overcome until we integrate. And we can't integrate until we as a country have a discussion about how we're going to organise it, how we're going to fund it, how we're going to make it sustainable in the long run, how are we actually going to realise these visions. And we can't realise a vision for a society without these disabling experiences until we're really serious about having a ministry or some other organisation to actually do that. And so it's really good. It's a starting point. It gives us a framework to bolt on the rest of what we need for an integrated system. But the messages I'm getting from the government are, we're not up for that yet. So it's a good step, but in the long run, it's not actually going to remove the discrimination that people experience based on cause of disability.
Warren, I'm hearing that there's a long way yet to go.
Yes, but we're starting.
Yeah.
And I don't want to leave it on a negative note. We're starting this. There's a future. There's a direction of travel. And if we all work together, we can actually start bringing about change. But these structural decisions about how you organise the structures that will deliver this, those decisions need to be made now. And if we can't get everything we need now, we need to have a plan on how we get from where we are now over the next 5 to 8 years to where we need to be. And that's the critical thing.
Excellent.
What we do now has to allow that evolution and transformation, not just of enabling good lives, but of all the other bits people need to live the best life they can without these negative disabling experiences.
Excellent, Warren. It's been so great to have you on the show. Just a couple more questions for you. How can people reach out to you? How can they get involved with any of the research that you're doing?
Look, great question, Jade. I don't practice as a barrister anymore in terms of helping individuals. So mainly now I do research, and I run a dispute resolution system called Talk Meet Resolve. So I'm pretty hard to get hold of as an individual. But what I will say is that as this research starts getting out there, what I'd encourage you to do is to read it, to share it, to talk about it. And again, we're trying to help create a framework that will make a difference for everyone. And you guys get to decide: do you like it or do you not like it? And I want this bit of what Warren is saying, I want this bit of what someone else is saying, I want this bit of this accessibility system that's designed, and I want this bit of what the government's saying. And together, these things I think will work for me. They're the conversations that people need to have with each other, with government, with MPs, because ultimately we're going to have a limited window. If we don't start doing this conversation and trying to shape this up in the next 12 months, then the foundation's going to be built, and it might be too late to really get this real long-term change in place.
Yeah. Warren, we've had 30 minutes of your time, and honestly, I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this ginormous topic of accessibility in New Zealand. If you wouldn't mind, there is something we do on this show. We always have a question of the week, and would you be so kind to play along with the people at home and maybe answer it for us?
I'll try.
So the question of the week this week, Warren, is what is a man?
Wow. So that's quite an interesting linguistic question. You can take it from a whole lot of different perspectives. Man in the law, we'd now call person. So in some of the Nordic countries, man is wider than a gendered, male or female. Here in Aotearoa, Tāne have a particular role. To me, I don't know. I'm a man. I don't know what makes me a man. Perhaps it's my connection to humankind. Perhaps it's my connection to the past. Perhaps it's my connection to the future. Those things might make me a man. But yeah, I think there's a very simple answer, but I think the simple answer is often wrong.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's very helpful for you. But there's a lot of different things that can make a man.
Warren, you are a great sport playing along with the question of the week. Warren Forster, researcher and barrister, thanks so much for joining the show this afternoon.
Kia ora, Jade and Hannah. Thank you for having me, and I hope that people out there like to engage with these ideas, because we certainly need a lot more of that over the next 6 to 12 months.
Thanks so much, Warren. We'll see you again.
Mā te wā.